Hello and welcome to School Day at NTTBF, hosted by the Library Science Program at Sam Houston University's College of Education. I'm Rebecca Marsick and I'm a literacy coach in Westport, Connecticut. Today, I'm honored to moderate the thriller panel. We have amazing authors that I'm super excited to hear from today. Sona Charaipotra is the co-author of the recently released The Rumor Game. It's the third book you've written with Danielle Clayton, right? Yeah. And just a fun fact about Sona, while she co-founded Cake Literary with Danielle Clayton, her favorite cake to eat is spice cake. There's first fun fact. Karen McManus is our next author. She is the author of You'll Be the Death of Me and many, many, many other books. It's her fourth thriller, right? You'll Be the Death of Me, fifth thriller. And her favorite Disney villain is Maleficent, which now has me like over-analyzing the villains in your books. And our final author is Jennifer Lynn Barnes. She's the author of the Inheritance Games trilogy and also many other trilogies and books. And her characters are impacted by her training as a developmental psychologist. So there's a lot of psychology involved in her characters. And we'll just dive right in. I am really curious to know, who was your favorite thriller author as a kid? So like, if you're thinking about as a child, who was your favorite thriller author? Anyone who wants to start.
Well, the first mystery I ever read was Agatha Christie, and then there were none. So that was the first of many, and it's still one of my top 3 favorite mystery books.
So I have 2 answers to this. One is that growing up, I read a lot of Babysitter's Club and Sweet Valley, and they had these whole separate lines that were mysteries. So you'd get your normal series, and then they'd be like, but it's the Babysitter's Club solving mysteries, or you'd get those. So I read a lot of those. And simultaneously at the same time, on sort of the complete other end of the spectrum, when I was in 4th grade, I found my mom's stash of Mary Higgins Clark books.
Oh. Loved.
And my 4th grade teacher, that was her favorite author. And she told us all it was her favorite author. And I was like, oh, Mrs. Chronister loves this author. So I started reading them. My mom walked by. She's like, you're reading Mary Higgins Clark? And I was like, yeah, this is good. And so then I showed up at school like the next day, and it was like, drop everything and read time. And I got out my Mary Higgins Clark book, and my 4th grade teacher was like, what are you reading? And I'm like, really good.
So
the power of a teacher suggestion. Sorry, Sona, go ahead.
Okay. When I started, it was Nancy Drew because, girl power mystery, you got to do it. But Babysitter's Club, I remember that line. That was a really fun line. And then I ventured into horror, and I was doing a lot of Stephen King and obviously like the Goosebumps series and things like that. That informed my childhood a lot.
I feel like there's so much crossover among all of that, and I see it in your books as well. So I'm really curious, how do you map your stories? So thinking about all these different like twists and turns, I just imagine you all have these like huge walls in your house with like note cards and strings like attaching everything. So I'm really curious, how do you keep track of all of these different plot points? Because you all weave them in so beautifully. So how do you map them out and keep track of them?
I mean, I can start with that one because I am a major plotter. Like, I come from screenwriting. That was my original writing background, and everything is like 3-act structure and plot and all of that stuff. And so when working on one of these books, definitely plotting everything is a big part of things. And it's almost like building 3 layers of a cake. Like each character has their own arc, and then you got to plant the red herrings. You got to figure out where those go and stuff like that. It's a lot. It's literally like mapping. The way you see one of those boards from the killer plotting in one of the books. Yeah, it's essentially
that's what I picture. So do you use a computer or you do it by hand?
I use this really kick-ass app. I'm allowed to say kick-ass, I think. It's called Plotter, but it's Plottr with no E in it. And it is like the note card function in something like Scrivener, except that you can do multiple layers and color code and stuff like that. It's really awesome.
Oh, that's great.
And I am a notebook girl, like a journal girl. So I do it all by hand. And a lot of what I do in the beginning, I just write down all the things I don't know that I think I need to know. And then I'll have a list of like 22 questions. And then I'll go through and by hand, I'll just write out, well, here's one possible answer, but I don't like this about that. And here's this and this. And then eventually I'm working on a new book right now. And I've got literally 65 pages of notes in my journal trying to figure out how all of this ties together. And then I kind of from that will pull out, okay, well, here's the 2 pages of actual stuff that's going on here. But I do, and then I put that in a document that I can't lose because I have a really bad habit of losing the journals because I have small children and they're like, journal, and they run off with it. But for some reason, I always have to do it kind of by hand. And then in revision, I'll often use physical index cards, which the last time I did that, I realized that my stack of index cards was literally this tall. And I was like, perhaps that is why my editor has told me to simplify the plot of this book. And I'm like, I can get it down to this tall.
So do you map out the whole trilogy, or you do a book at a time and then?
So I generally know the beginning and the end, and then I know the puzzle sequence of each book. And then in each book, I plant some of the clues that will come into play in the future book, if there is a future book. But I actually wrote all 3 books in the trilogy, not knowing for sure if there was going to be a next book, at least while I was writing the first draft. And so I know what the gist of what the next thing is going to be. And I know what some of the big twists and things I want to plant are. But I also have to tie each book kind of up in case there's not one. I got to add like I added a new ending to book 1 once I found out there would be a book 2. But so it's kind of there underneath, and I don't plan out all of it because when I go to write book 2, I'm like, here's the 36 things I need to know that I don't know yet. But I kind of know some of the things I've already planted.
How about you, Karen?
I am not that visual of a thinker when I'm plotting. I don't have a murder board. I think that would be cool, but I just don't think that way. I think in a really linear way. I think about, I don't have a screenwriting background, but I started looking at screenwriting tools when I was trying to figure out how to get better at my craft because my plots were kind of all over the place. And I started using a beat sheet, which is sort of spreadsheet based. And that really worked for me. That's kind of how my brain works. It's like, okay, you need to hit these beats. And then now I just need to think about how am I going to get from one point to the other and what's going to happen there. So I tend to do just real basic outlines. I like chapter, point of view, because I always do multiple point of view. What's the major plot point I need to get across? What's the major character beat I need to get across? And like, what am I working toward? What big moment am I working toward? And when does that happen? And then I tend to, kind of reassess when I hit that point. So my outlines are very detailed at the beginning, much looser at the end, but they get more detailed as I go along. But I do, like Jen, I know the end typically. I'm not always 100% sure how I'm going to get there. And occasionally the end changes.
I was amazed. I read or saw an interview with you saying that it took you 2 months to draft One of Us is Lying and then 2 months to revise, and that was it, which just seems incredible to me for a text that had that many different twists and turns. And I mean, I think I read that in one night. So that was amazing to me.
If things are going well, that's about how long it takes. And then you got to revise it, even it took me 2 months to revise on my own. Then I had to revise with my agent and my editor, and that all took a lot longer. But if it's flowing, I'm a relatively quick drafter.
That's great. You brought up the multiple perspectives piece. So you and Sona both wrote in multiple perspectives with these books. And I'm wondering what you think having all these perspectives adds to a thriller story, like being able to tell the story from these different characters' points of view. Because as a reader, I feel like every time you get to a different character, you see the story differently, versus when you have a singular perspective. So I'm just curious about how and why you decide to do it that way.
Yeah, I think one of the benefits is that you get to tell a complex story from varying perspectives, and everybody has their own take on it. And in my books, everyone tends to be concealing something also. So they're going to be, you're going to see it differently from their point of view, depending on what they're trying to hide, either from themselves or from the other, part of the ensemble. I also like the fact that with multi-POV, you can really take the reader right to the edge of discovering something, and then you switch, when you're in someone else's point of view, and you're not going to learn that thing you thought you were going to learn because now we're in somebody else's head. So it's a way to draw out suspense as well. And I just personally like ensembles. I like teams. And I think that mysteries are a great place to have a lot of connection and conflict between people. And you can have a lot of fun with kind of bringing them together, pulling them apart, and then, having them ultimately maybe come back together one last time, because it's the only way they can solve what's going on.
Sona, what would you say?
I think for me, it's similar to what Karen said, where it's like every character is sort of unreliable in their take on things, and like unraveling who is the most reliable of the unreliable characters is sort of a fun part of the process. And like, what are they concealing on purpose, and what do they really not realize about themselves or about the situation? I think that's always interesting to sort of parcel out. And then, the tension thing is great, because you can really literally get to the edge of something and then not do the reveal, and sometimes spin the whole thing in a different direction with the next character.
I felt like I kept trusting and then not trusting the girls in the room. I was like, oh, but I believed her. And then, so it is really interesting. And then I guess, Jen, I would ask you, because I do feel like you have an ensemble in the Inheritance trilogy, but it's not from multiple perspectives. So why not? And I guess,
interestingly enough, so book one was an easy first person for me, because it's this eccentric billionaire dies and leaves his entire fortune to this teenage girl he's never met, and she has no clue as to why. But to inherit, she has to move into his sprawling, secret passage-filled mansion along with his 4 very hot grandsons who were just disinherited. And so she was coming in as the outsider. And I really liked, it's a wish fulfillment story, right? And it's also a mystery of who she can trust. And these 4 very hot, very magnetic, very charismatic grandsons are all hot and charismatic and magnetic, but can you trust them, right? So if I was going into any of their perspectives, I'd be handing that tension away, because they sort of, in book one, they needed to be mysteries that she was trying to solve. Like, there's the mystery of why the guy left her the stuff. All of the brothers have secrets. It's their background. And so she's discovering all of that. So I had to stay in first person. But it is an ensemble. So there are like a lot of relationship arcs that don't involve the main character, which is so hard to write in first person, because you have to think of a reason that Avery just happens to be there when these other 2 characters are having a really romantic moment, or when these brothers are having a really great brotherly thing. So after book one, I was like, I am done doing it this way. First person is so hard for these books. We now know we kind of trust these brothers. So I'm doing first person, but I'm going to do interstitial. So random chapters throughout from the perspectives of all 4 brothers. So I wrote the first draft of book 2, The Hawthorne Legacy, with all 4 Hawthorne brothers got points of view. So I could explain all of those. And I sent it in to my editor. And it wasn't a ton of pages. It was probably 30 pages scattered throughout the entire books, where you got to see these great moments with the boys. And she was like, I feel like that's sapping some of Avery's agency. And it was just diverting from her story. And this was still really her story. So I ended up cutting all of those points of views I'd written, even though there were some moments I really loved where you get to see the brothers. And then I had to go back and do the like, okay, so she's here at this moment and we cut out and we don't know what happens in there, but maybe fans can imagine that. Like maybe that's your
you got to release that. That's
maybe
bonus
that's your
content.
That actually was the bonus content in the Barnes and Noble special edition of the Hawthorne Legacy. You got those. And like some of them you get because I'm like, okay, so I have to have them pocket dial Avery as they're playing this game with each other. And so you find those different things. But writing book 3 was the same thing. It's still first person point of view to Avery, except now I have all these series long relationship arcs of romantic relationships for different people, all the different shipping possibilities, all of these different things. And so that's actually harder for me to balance than all the plot elements. So there's all of these puzzles, there's all of this mystery. That's easy. Figuring out how to tell this story with this enormous cast and all of these relationships while stuck inside the point of view of one person is actually really hard. So I'm like, maybe for my next book, I'll try those other points of view, except I've written like 23 books and only one of them was not first person.
So my daughter read the 2 books before I did, and she was like, so which boy is your favorite? I'm like, I don't know, I can't pick. And she's like, I know, me neither.
Why choose?
Exactly. But you all have really strong female characters at the core of your texts. And I'm wondering, like, are they inspired by people you know, yourself? How do you craft these female characters who are really powerful? I think whether or not they do things that I would agree with, they still are real forces in your books. I'm just wondering what inspires you, or who.
Well, my very first book, One of Us is Lying, the character of Bronwyn was inspired by my 2 nieces, even though they were too young to be Bronwyn. But they have a similar background. Their dad's Colombian, their mom is Irish. And I just thought of the kind of girl that I thought they would grow into, and the kind of girl that they would like to read about. And what I like to do with my female characters is they're not all strong in the same ways. You know, like Bronwyn's very smart, you know, she's very stubborn, she gets things done. Addie is a lot more passive at first. You know, she kind of needs to grow into herself, but she has this core that comes out throughout the book. In my latest book, You'll Be the Death of Me, Ivy is another, you know, smart, stubborn girl, but she has horrible insecurity, you know, almost crippling at times. And that really holds her back. And it's something that she needs to overcome, but it doesn't keep her from being strong. You know, it's just one of those flaws that she has to learn to navigate. So that's what I always try to do, is present people who feel balanced, you know, but can still get that job done.
Yeah.
Jen,
Sona?
I never want to jump in and accidentally end up speaking over someone, and then I just end up smiling at it. And
you.
I feel like in my first drafts, my characters are, when I'm writing, especially when I'm writing first person, since I am so focused in on that, I tend to have a lot of in common with my characters, not necessarily in terms of background or even emotional makeup, but in terms of the way they think. Like I'm kind of an overthinker and someone who loves thinking and learning. And, you know, the Inheritance Games has a ton of puzzles and I love puzzles. So like Avery's thought process about something in the first draft always looks just like mine would. And then as I'm revising, especially a first book in a series, the big question I ask myself is like, how did she become someone who was so capable of going toe to toe with these 4 boys who've been raised by this billionaire who spent all of this money and all of this time trying to form them into almost these superhuman creatures. And yet this girl shows up, and even though they've spent their entire lives solving puzzles and riddles, she's just as good at it as they are. Even though they've been given every privilege known to man, like she can go toe to toe with them. And so then, you know, you mentioned at the beginning, I'm a developmental psychologist. So I tend to do a lot of going back and forth between the person's childhood and the traits they have now. And often I start with the trait they have now, and then I think, how did they become that person? So what combination of nature and nurture led to this? So what were they like at age 4? And then what were these primary events in their life? So often like, what was their relationship with their parents? And sometimes I get really involved because I'm like, then I need to know what their parents' relationships with their parents are like. I end up going back, like I did this for a character in the book I'm looking on now, where I'd gone back like 2 generations from where the character was, to kind of figure out how they became that person. And then that will give me, when I come up with, I'm like, ooh, that did happen in their childhood. That gives me a new trait to come forward with. So I like bounce back and forth between the present and the past, kind of trying to, like, I usually start with a very basic trope. but then trying to turn that trope into a person by understanding sort of the environment they grew up in and those formative influences.
Yeah, what you said, Jennifer, is really interesting because, like, when I actually think about it, in all of my work, including the collaborations, but also the individual work, that's also a thing where the formative thing is the family structure. And like, we talk a lot about how the parents are missing in YA, but the parents in these books are always there, but they're so fraught themselves that you can see the root of where whatever trauma these characters are carrying is coming from. But the other thing that I always work really hard to try to do with these girls, I always say my characters are always hungry girls in so many different ways. They're always hungry for something very specific. And that's sort of the engine that drives the story for each character. Like, what is that desire that they want? But also, like, we come to it from a place of who the characters are, because it's the same setting for these three different characters, but racially, culturally, like, as far as sexuality goes, just class-wise too, like all the things that inform who they are as people, I think that really makes them. And then that's the engine that makes them strong in their own individual ways, as Karen had said.
Thank you. I have a few audience questions that I want to get to before I have other ones that I would ask, but someone asked, do you ever write about and publish ideas or messages in your works that go against what you believe in? So do you ever have your characters do things or say things or, have something happen that you don't believe in? And then if so, why do you make this decision? And if not, I guess, why not?
I guess I can start with that one because if you've read Tiny Pretty Things at all, I always hear that the characters are not very likable in that book. And I'm sure we're going to hear it for Rumor Game too, because it's also got a lot of things happening and there's a lot of bullying involved. And some of the characters are the ones perpetrating the bullying. And I do think that's not something I would do myself. I do think that's something that happens in reality. And so it's important to me that kids get to see their own experiences on the page. And it's also important that when we're weaving those stories together, we're trying to plant some of the information or actions in the books that if somebody needs help with that kind of situation, they can start to find their way to it. For example, in the Rumor Game, there's some abusive situations and there's also some eating disorder related content. So there is a psychologist right there on the page, and she is addressing those issues. And we thought it was really important to do that because we're talking about the South Asian community specifically, and there's not a lot of discussion within the community about those kinds of issues. And I want to see that start to shift. So that's why the psychologist is there on the page for that.
Thank you. Karen, Jen?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, all of my characters need a chance to grow. So they're typically going to start out with some behaviors and maybe some beliefs that I don't share. They need to maybe, go through what I'm going to put them through to get to a different point. My books tend to have, an overarching theme. A lot of times it has to do with acceptance of yourself, of other people, of the darker parts of yourself that you're trying to hide, and figuring out a way to integrate that, change it if you want to, or accept it if you don't. And so the characters have to go through that journey. And it's not always pretty. There's dark things that happen in my books. Sometimes things can get a little twisted, but I hope that ultimately at the end, where you see the characters, you kind of get the sense of what I as an author value and also what the characters value.
So I'm going to put on my psychologist hat again for my answer. So I spent many years as a psychology professor. This is my first semester not professoring and writing full time. And my specialty is the psychology of fiction. And one of the specific things I studied is fiction and morality. Both how does fiction affect morality? How do we import morality into fiction? How do we export morality out of fiction? Right. And there's all of these theories. Like there's a guy named Hakemulder. I don't know his first name because academics rarely know anyone's first name. But he called fiction a moral laboratory. He thought one of the functions of fiction, one of the things that it does for you, as that when you're reading fiction, you're honing your own sense and your own judgments of what's right and wrong. And it's not because everyone on the page is doing the right thing all the time, or because everyone has the beliefs that you're supposed to emulate all the time. It's because when you as a reader are encountering people doing those things, when you have empathy for characters who are, being bullied in this case, or even understanding why it's happening. So not emotional empathy, but cognitive empathy of understanding how different people are working. That's what they think is kind of honing the morality. So like the act of reading, the act of getting inside other people's heads, the act of learning to empathize, does not rely on the people on the page making the correct moral decisions, right? So I think as an author, you have to have a sense, like Karen was talking about, of theme. Like, what is it that you want to say with the book? But what you're saying with the book isn't necessarily what the characters are saying with the book, right? It's about what you're inspiring people to think about themselves. And not everyone who reads the book is going to walk away with the same theme I intended, right? So they're going to, because they're contributing to what they read. They are active readers and audiences, and they're getting all of this stuff out there. But what seems to really matter is the process of doing that, sort of the cognitive structures you have to engage to read a book, to fall in love with the characters, to see what's happening, to guess these different things, to feel with them. That seems to have very real effects on people. And in my old lab, we actually did a study on the moral correlates of reading young adult literature. And it was an author recognition test, which is we just give them a bunch of names that were either fake names or they were names of authors who wrote young adult novels, and only young adult novels. These were people who'd never written middle grade or adult. And it turned out that the people who recognized more of the YA author names, and in our case, not the adult author names, only the YA author names, it was associated with some positive indicators of morality, such as empathy. So it's really interesting that I think when people think morality in fiction, they think it's because the characters are moral, but that doesn't on a psychological level seem to be what's going on at all.
That's fascinating. I didn't even know there was a psychology of fiction. I might have taken a different path. That's fascinating. Thank you. So I guess playing off of that, if you weren't an author, what would your other job be? What would you do instead? And it can't be developmental psychologist, Jen. You have to something else. For all of you, what would you do if you weren't an author? What's another passion?
See, I feel like my only passion is being an author, honestly. Like I did other stuff for 20 years, and I did other communications things that weren't writing fiction. I wrote other things, business writing, studied journalism, was in PR, was in marketing for a while. And it took me a long time to realize that it was fiction that I really loved and cared about. So, for me, this is kind of it. I finally got here.
And I'm going to break the rule because I had a dual career for a long, long time. I wrote my first published novel when I was 19. I was an undergrad, and then I spent 23 books having a dual career. So my entire adult life was spent with one toe in writing and one toe in psychology. And it's only in the past few months that I've devoted myself entirely to writing. And so I do have multiple passions. I loved it. It just got to the point. I also have 3 small children, age 5 and under, and it just got to the point where I could not do it all anymore. So that if I was not doing writing, I for sure would still be a psychology professor and still doing science.
Great. So my current day job is senior editor at Parents Magazine, and I spent the last 20 years, like Jen, in a dual career. I've spent 20 years in magazines. I started at People as a red carpet reporter, and and work my way through the ranks. And for a while as the editor of the Barnes and Noble teen blog, which was like my favorite job ever because it was like literally worlds collide. So my next book coming out in July is called How Maya Got Fierce, and it's set in the magazine world. It's like the bold type meets younger, where a 17-year-old accidentally gets a job at a magazine and they think she's 26. So it's gonna be fun.
I love that.
So worlds collide again. So
Great
Yeah.
concept.
So it sounds like you've all been informed by other aspects of your life, other careers, other passions, other jobs. So what advice would you give an aspiring thriller writer about how to not just break into the industry, but what to do in order to find their stories and their voice and write? And what advice would you give?
I think for me, it's like you learn so much just living your life, and it all ends up somewhere on the page at some point. So like exploring all those different things, like varying career paths, being a waitress, being a librarian, driving a truck, I don't know, all the different things you can do in your life. I think that's just fodder for your fiction at some point. So use it.
Any other thoughts, like how to even just becoming a writer? Because I feel like there's so many kids who just feel like they're not writers when we all know that everyone's a writer. But what advice would you give for someone who doesn't feel confident in their writing and but really wants to?
Yeah, I always tell people, like, let someone else tell you no, because that's not what I did. When I was in high school, I did like to write. I liked to write fiction and I was trying to do it, but I didn't know how. And I didn't know any other people who did it. And I just decided, well, I can't do it because it's hard. And so I'm not going to do it anymore. And I didn't for a very long time. And then when I started writing again, I still sort of felt that way, like, oh, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm not very good at this. But this time I actually did put my work out there. And a lot of people did tell me no, for two whole books. I heard hundreds of no's. But, no is not a failure. It's just part of the process. If no one tells you no, A, you're not putting yourself out there. B, there's no opportunity to get feedback and improve. So you just have to kind of let go of that mindset that you have to be good at something right away, or that, it takes a certain amount of time. And if you haven't hit it at that time, then forget it. It's not happening for you.
So it took me 7 books to sell one. So my 7th I wrote was the first one that sold. I started when I was in high school. And I think the only way you can get practice at writing is writing. Right. And so the purpose of the first book you write isn't necessarily to be good, right? It's to be written, because the only way you can get good at writing. I mean, there are people who sit down and somehow their first book they ever type out, they knock it out of the park. But like, that wasn't me. Like the first book I wrote was so bad. Like it was so bad. And then the second one was maybe a little less bad. And the second, and you develop the skills by doing it. So even if everyone tells you no, that time isn't wasted. And so the other thing I like to say is don't ever compare your first draft to someone else's final draft, because every book you read has been through so much. It's had so many people's hands on it. It's been revised so many times, right? And so even like as an author who's written a lot of books, I often am writing my first books and my first draft, and I'm like, it's like I've lost it. Like my last book was so much better and everyone else's books are so much better. And it's because it's a first draft, right? And so the first draft's job is to exist. And then once it exists, you can revise it and do something with it, or you can go write a new first draft of something else. But no time spent writing is wasted, because you have to spend that time to develop those skills.
Yeah. Sometimes I like to go back and look at my first drafts, when I'm feeling nervous about starting my next book, and just remind myself how bad it can be.
That's a good strategy.
And it still turns out okay.
So when you just made me think of, are there ever times where you've written and you go back and read and you think like, this is just too dark or too gory or too scary? And specifically in thinking about the audience that you're writing for, do you ever pull back a bit on the darkness of it, or no?
I mean, I don't, but I don't think, I mean, this could just be me, but I don't think my books are that dark. I feel like they are dark in subject matter sometimes, but they're lighter in tone. And there's a lot of connection, and there's a lot of hope, and there's a lot of growth. So I always feel like most of the really scary stuff doesn't necessarily happen on the page.
I've never ended up pulling anything back for that reason. Inheritance Games is, oh gosh, she got left $42 billion. But the series I wrote before that was a 4-book series called The Naturals, which is about an FBI think tank that uses teenagers to profile serial killers. And the teenagers weren't that dark in that. Some of them were, but, they're having fun. They're playing truth or dare. They're profiling serial killers. But there were also some passages from the points of view of the serial killer, and they were written in the second person. So those chapters were always called you. And it's like you pick up the knife. You run a hand down the girl's chain, or, so they were really creepy. And I always say, I don't know what it says about me as a person, or a writer, that those were the only chapters in those books that weren't heavily revised. Like across 4 books, they're just like, this serial killer stuff, you're good. Just leave it as it is. They're like, your normal people need some work, but the serial killers are just pitch perfect.
Nailed it.
yeah, like that really awesome kiss, that needs some work, but those serial killer moments. But, part of making stuff scary, I think, is also realizing it's what you don't include that's as scary as what you do include. So even though you get those, it's like, when do you cut away from the serial killer's point of view, right? Like, so they're not actually, like, I think they're super creepy, but they're not actually gory, because sometimes what your imagination is going to come up with is going to be way scarier than anything I could actually put on the page if I'm directing you exactly what to imagine.
Great.
Yeah, we have some stuff back. But honestly, like, a lot of what we're drawing from is what teenagers actually experience. And that is some scary stuff. So, I mean, like, a lot of kids are dealing with a lot of scary stuff in real life. So,
Yeah,
it's very true. Okay, we only have about 3 more minutes. So I want to do a very quick fire round with you all. I just have a few questions, like 1 answer each. So we could, I'm just looking at my screen. We could do Jen, Sona, Karen. I'm just going to fire some questions. So in first, what's that?
So you don't want to go first, but okay.
Oh, you are first. Okay. So in thinking about the book, your most current book, which of your characters would be TikTok famous?
Xander.
I think it would be Cora.
Ivy.
All right. Where is your favorite place to write?
My bed.
Same.
My desk, right here.
What is your least favorite food?
I can't think of a current least favorite. For a long time, it was chocolate. I know, but then I had kids and now I like chocolate. It's weird.
Mine is decidedly mayonnaise.
I don't like any seafood. Living in New England is wasted on me.
All right. Which of your characters is the most unlike you in your current book?
Every single one of the Hawthorne brothers.
For me, it's Bryn.
Mateo, he is way more direct than I can ever be.
And then my last question, other than your own book, which obviously everyone should read, what book should the audience read next?
Oh gosh, this always takes me so long. So I'll just go with one I finished recently that was great, which is The Marvelous by Claire Kahn.
I'm going to recommend Sunny G's series of Rash Decisions by Navdeep Singh Dhillon, who happens to be my husband, but also the book is very funny and it's like a cosplaying prom night adventure. So And he's going to be at the festival. So go find him.
Fun. I had to go look at my books because like, I know I just read something really good and my mind always goes blank when someone asks me that question. But I finished The Paris Apartment by Lucy Foley, and it was such a great adult thriller.
Great. I'm going to write all these down and come back to them. So thank you all so much for doing this today and talking to students and teachers and all of us. And we just appreciate you and your books. And thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
To our audience, have a wonderful day and pick up all of these books.
Bye, everyone.